In the great kingdom of Ajoran, where the sun bathed the golden fields and the rivers whispered secrets to the wind, there lived a young prince named Olumide. He was tall, strong, and as handsome as a warrior carved by the gods. The women of the land admired him, and the men envied his status. But while his face was as smooth as fine ivory, his heart was as rough as unpolished stone. Olumide was arrogant. He walked with his chin high, his voice sharp with pride. His father, King Beggar, ruled with wisdom and mercy, but Olumide had no patience for kindness. He saw himself as above others, believing the poor were poor because they were weak, and the rich were rich because they were strong. One scorching afternoon, Olumide and his friends rode through the bustling marketplace on their fine horses. The air smelled of roasted yams, smoked fish, and fresh palm wine. Merchants shouted their prices, children ran barefoot through the narrow paths, and drummers played lively rhythms to entertain the crowd. Then, by the roadside, Olumide saw him, an old beggar, dressed in rags so tattered they barely held together, sat with a wooden bowl in his trembling hands. His skin was dry and cracked like the earth in the harmattan season, and his eyes were heavy with years of suffering. "Please, kind sirs," the beggar said, his voice weak, "spare some food or water for an old man." The villagers averted their eyes. Some pitied him, but none stopped. Olumide pulled the reins of his horse, smirking. His friends laughed, watching closely to see how their prince would respond. "You are old and useless," Olumide said, looking down at the beggar. "Why should I waste good food on a man who cannot work? Even the goats in my father's palace have more value than you." The beggar raised his weary eyes. "A man is not measured by his wealth, young prince," he said, "but by his heart." Olumide laughed, a cruel sound that echoed through the marketplace. "If a man is measured by his heart, then I must be the greatest of all, for my heart beats with the blood of kings." The beggar sighed and shook his head. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo beyond the world of men, he whispered, "You will learn, young prince. You will learn soon enough." That night, the winds changed in Ajoran, and the prince's fate was sealed. Olumide awoke the next morning feeling strangely weak. His limbs were heavy as though the gods had filled them with stone. He reached for his royal robes, but his fingers fumbled, trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. His breath was short, his chest rising and falling as if he had run for miles. Something was wrong. He stumbled to the large mirror in his chamber, and what he saw made his blood turn to ice. His face, his youthful, flawless face, was gone. In its place was the face of an old man. His smooth skin had turned wrinkled and sagged. His thick black hair was now gray and thin. His arms, once strong like the roots of a mighty baobab tree, were weak and frail. Prince Olumide had aged overnight. Terror gripped his heart. He stumbled back, knocking over a stool. His breathing grew ragged as he grabbed at his face, pinching his skin as if he could peel away the years. No, this is not possible. He rushed to the doors, calling for his servants. But when they entered and saw him, they gasped in horror. Who is this old man?" one of them whispered. "It is I," Olumide shouted. "It is Prince Olumide." The guards exchanged nervous glances. "This man is mad," one whispered. "We must remove him," another said. Before Olumide could protest, they seized him roughly and dragged him through the palace halls. "Stop this at once. I am your prince," he bellowed, but his voice was weak, no longer the commanding tone of royalty. The palace gates opened, and with a swift push, they threw him onto the dusty road. The doors slammed shut behind him. Prince Olumide was no longer a prince. He was now a beggar. For the first time in his life, Olumide felt hunger. His stomach twisted in pain, growling like an angry beast. His throat was dry, parched from thirst. He wandered through the village, calling out to familiar faces, but none recognized him. The merchants who once bowed to him now ignored him. The women who once batted their eyelashes at him now turned away in disgust. At the palace gates, he begged the guards, "Please, let me see the king. I am his son." But they only laughed and shoved him away. "We do not let beggars speak to the king," one sneered. Days passed, then weeks. Olumide wandered from village to village, his once proud walk now a slow, painful shuffle. He knocked on doors, begging for food, but most people turned him away. Some gave him scraps, others poured water in his hands. But no one gave him respect. One afternoon, exhausted and broken, he collapsed beneath a baobab tree at the edge of a village. His body was weak. His spirit was shattered. He had never known suffering like this. It was then that he heard a voice. "You have walked the road of the proud. Have you learned?" Olumide looked up, his vision blurred from hunger and tears. Standing before him was a beggar, but now he did not look weak. His back was straight. His eyes burned with the power of something beyond human understanding. "Please," Olumide whispered, his voice shaking. "I was foolish. I was cruel. I see that now. I have learned." The beggar knelt beside him. "And what have you learned?" "Prince Olumide." Tears ran down Olumide's face. "I have learned that no man is greater than another, that kindness is worth more than gold, that the mighty can fall, just as the lowly can rise." The beggar smiled, and just like that, warmth rushed through Olumide's body. His hands grew steady, his back straightened. The wrinkles faded from his skin. Strength returned to his limbs. He was young again, but the lesson would stay with him forever. When Olumide returned to Ajoran, the people were astonished. They had thought the prince was dead, but here he was, alive, but changed. He no longer walked with arrogance. His voice no longer carried pride. He moved with humility, and in his eyes was the wisdom of a man who had seen both sides of life. When he saw a beggar on the road, he did not turn away. Instead, he knelt, offered food, and listened to their stories. Years later, when he became king, Ajoran became a kingdom known not for its wealth, but for its kindness. No beggar was turned away, no man was left to suffer alone. And to this day, the elders in the village tell the story of the prince who learned a lesson the hard way. So, if you ever pass by a beggar on the road, remember, you never know who they truly are, because sometimes the gods walk among men, disguised in rags, waiting to test the hearts of those who think themselves mighty.